Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. Project Build around Bryce Underwood is about to get underway for this Michigan program. And the big talking point to me is you have this quarterback that we all know as Michigan fans can win at the highest level of the sport. You want to make sure you're immediately surrounding him with the pieces for him to be successful year one at Michigan. Look, this is a hot take, but it's something I truly believe in. And many of y'all know who've been rocking with the fellas for a while. I'm not a guy that stands on the table and asks for true freshman quarterback to start right away. Look, Bryce Underwood to me is a different cat. One, this kid has played a ton of football at the high school ranks, has been starting since his freshman year of high school. I think number two is physically just ready to step on a college football field and have a lot of success. So I think the plan is, personally, to have Bryce Underwood be your starting quarterback immediately in 2025. Now, if that's the plan, you got to make sure you're building a lot of pieces around him so he can have that immediate success. Now, last week we talked about potential offensive coordinator hires. That's certainly an important conversation. The next important conversation is, hey, you got to surround him with some pieces on the football field as well. I think most notably in the pass catcher department. But we're also going to get into a conversation about what that offensive line might look like. And Dill, a few targets on the middle of that defensive line as well. Fired up to get into this now. Before we do, and as always, and most importantly, Michigan fans, let it fly in the comment section. One, the amount of support y'all have shown the fellas over the last 7 days has been amazing. As Michigan fans, it's been very fun to talk about this program, what we're doing on the recruiting trail. So appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, first one on the list. And this is a combination of guys that are currently in the transfer portal, but also guys that I've kind of looked at and said, hey, I think this name could be in the transfer portal over the next couple of weeks. Let's start with probably my favorite target, the number 2 overall target in the transfer portal right now, former Texas wide receiver Jonte Cook, a guy that Michigan took a swing at coming out of high school in 2023, finds his way back in the transfer portal. Dill, when I look at Michigan, one of the things you can sell, and you talked about this before we went live, Michigan can sell this offense is going to be different. When we were recruiting Jonte Cook out of high school, it's not a very attractive offense for, 5-star caliber wide receivers. We didn't bring Bryce Underwood in to treat him like Cade McNamara. And we are going to open up this offense. But I think more importantly, the reason Jonte Cook's in the transfer portal is he felt like he wasn't getting enough opportunity to play for Texas. Hey, look, we got a wide receiver room that is, in my belief, kind of up for the taking. You're going to have an opportunity to be a central part in this offense. Jonte Cook from Texas, how are we feeling about him in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, no, he is certainly one of the guys. And I think you go back to that spring game, I was quite impressed by his game. I think everyone kind of knew from his high school days that I think they thought he was just a vertical burner. That's kind of what was the selling point from the high school recruiting trail. But I think a guy who runs good routes underneath, catches in traffic, does some of those things that again, maybe separates him from a Darius Hayward base, some of those real speedsters, or John Ross, who never really developed into much. I think he's got the ability to play good, clean wide receiver. And frankly, Michigan really needs it. And I think it's a good fit for him because, you look at what Texas did to him. They just simply squeezed
I couldn't
him
believe it. I could not believe how much they just turned away from Jonte Cook. And that might be something, Sherrone Moore and this offensive staff needs to dig into. What was the reasoning why? Because what we saw from the spring game, what we saw as a true freshman, you kind of were excited about this kid going into year two.
And the reason, they bring in 3 kind
Agreed.
of high-level receivers from the portal, and then I think Texas being a little bit in that win-now mode, maybe they're apprehensive to play their young guys, but at the end of the day, I think he's a good enough player. And again, do I know any of the behind-the-scenes workings of this portal move? Definitely not. But assuming that that's all clean, he's a top.
What I love most about Jonte Cook is what he does after the catch. And that's something that for Michigan fans, it's been a disappointment. One, I don't think Kurt Campbell has done nearly a good enough job setting up these wide receivers in space. That's a separate conversation. But we don't really have too many guys that when they have the football in their hands, you're holding your breath. Jonte Cook's one of those guys that when he gets the football at any portion of the football field, you better hold your breath because he can hit those, game-changing plays. And for a guy like Bryce Underwood, who's going to be a true freshman, having a wide receiver that can do the rest for you, hey, little dump off and go make a game-changing play, I think that's massive to kind of surround him with that kind of guy. Now, the second wide receiver I want to talk about a guy that Michigan fans are familiar with, former Indiana wide receiver Donovan McCulley, kind of a wild. We recruited him out of the transfer portal 12 months ago, decides to go back to Indiana, hits the transfer portal again. Michigan was supposed to get him on a visit late October. I don't believe that visit happened. Dill 6'5", 205, elite at the catch point. That's another one of those missing pieces in this offense. Who is the wide receiver that you are kind of afraid of if you're a defense working vertically down the field on the boundary? I don't think we have that kind of guy. Donovan McCulley is that guy, and you kind of pair that up with how well Bryce Underwood throws the deep ball and attacks that deeper third. Donovan McCulley, and I think more importantly, like an experienced wide receiver that's played a lot of football. I think that's another selling point for a young quarterback to kind of surround him with a wide receiver that's been around the block a time or two in this Michigan offense.
Now, this one to me feels a little bit contingent, frankly, on how this class finishes up, this freshman class that is. Like, if they bring in Derrick Meadows, like, am I totally confident that Donovan McCulley has been like that guy in his college career? I don't know. I'm a little concerned about the fact that he couldn't even really crack the field at all for Indiana this year.
Well, Indiana's kind of sick, though.
Well, Indiana's got good wide receivers for sure, but the way that kind of all shook out, that certainly leaves you with some questions, more so than Jonte Cook. Jonte Cooks I kind of get a little bit more, but that like older guy not sniffing the field for Indiana, that leaves me frankly with a little bit of concerns. And I think then it is a little bit contingent on what the freshman class is, because they're bringing in some guys who kind of fit that profile.
So my take on Derrick Meadows, I just went on a tirade about Bryce Underwood being year one ready. I don't know if that's the same for Derrick Meadows. Derrick Meadows is dripping with traits, and if he gets maximized and if he gets developed, is going to be a very special wide receiver. But at the end of the day, Derrick Meadows has not had a ton of production at the high school ranks. I mean, that high recruiting ranking is very much contingent on what he could be, not what he is. And so I wouldn't mind bringing a guy like Donovan McCulley, who is, I don't think you're giving enough credit for as a known commodity. Was very good for Indiana in 2023, very good working vertically down the field. So to me, that's something I almost like. Do we think we're getting a future All-American in Donovan McCulley? No, but at least we're getting a known commodity that's played a lot of football. That's a guy that we kind of know what we're getting. I think that's kind of important if we were to take a guy like Derrick Meadows, who probably has a little bit more questions. Still, I'll give you another one I'm just going to put this on the screen. What do you think about it?
Huge fan. He'd be a monster. I think, again, he to me has really proved it. And the question about Donovan McCulley, frankly, is when he was on a really bad team, he was able to be relatively productive, not crazy numbers, obviously. Adam Randall is a guy who it's hard to really pinpoint what's gone on in that Clemson offense for years, but that's a big physical freak who, again, has had some huge moments at really high levels.
So the thing is, I'm a little less optimistic than you. It's not like I'm a big fan of this. I'd be over the moon if Michigan brings in Adam Randall, but I don't think he's necessarily a proven commodity, right? He has struggled with injuries. The physical traits haven't matched the on-field production. And I think you're right. Like, looking at that Clemson offense, that could be a storyline. I also think he might have gotten phased out by some younger wide receivers like TJ Moore and Brian Wesco, regardless of that fact. I mean, Donovan McCulley's a little bit more of like a higher floor, lower ceiling. You kind of know what you're going to get. I don't think you're going to get a first-team All-Big Ten guy, but you're going to get a pretty solid wide receiver. Adam Randall, if he puts it together, he could be a first-team All-Big Ten caliber guy. I mean, at 6'3", 230, running an 11-1 in the 100-meter coming out of high school, this guy looks like Megatron pretty much. Now, it's like, if you go grab him in the transfer portal, and I should probably say he's not in the transfer portal right now, but that's a name that I think could be in the transfer portal. The ceiling is so high for Adam Randall. One more at the wide receiver position that I want to get your take on. Another guy that, just as a Michigan fan, maybe kind of wishful thinking. Very certainly could go to the NFL draft. But if he doesn't, I think he'll be hitting the transfer portal because, Baran Brown has been an elite wide receiver that's just been rotting away on a horrible Kentucky team. Baran Brown in Ann Arbor, how are we feeling?
Oh, if he hits, he's above Jonte Cook. Like, he immediately steps right to the front of the line as the best wide receiver in the transfer portal by far. I don't see, those type of guys just don't come open that often who are elite proven at the big schools, because the big schools don't let those type of kids go a whole lot.
Well, but the thing is, Kentucky, that's a school where they might have to let those kids kind of go.
Well, yeah, because Mike Stoops might get fired this year. They've been so bad. He has not been able to live up to his potential at all. he'd be a guy. Yeah, if they could get a shot at Baran Brown, he would be.
Yeah, a little background for Baran Brown. 10.49 and 100 meter coming out of high school. And that, like, I probably overuse track time sometimes. I will tell you right now that track time translates to the football field. This is a kid that is by far the fastest football player on the field every time he touches the football, every time he touches the field. He can work vertically. He can be electric with the football in his hands. Some consistency issues, which I think more just chalked up to like kind of young wide receiver and also playing for quarterbacks that just can't hit the broadside of the barn. But this is, again, a guy that's been contributing since his true freshman year and is the sky's the limit for what Baran Brown can do. Now, Dill, the next conversation is the offensive line. And my take on the offensive line, I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts. I don't think that's a massive position of concern. I think this unit has a lot of young talent that Sherrone Moore in this program has recruited that's kind of going up the pipeline, especially on the inside. If there was one position on the offensive line that you could maybe see Michigan go out and get, it's probably that left tackle with Miles Hinton moving on after this year. Now, the caveat is Andrew Babalow is coming in as a true freshman who I think might need a year. Ty Haywood potentially could be coming in. He might be a guy that could play early. You have Andrew Sprague, Gentry, Blake Frazier. Like, you have some names, but not necessarily a proven name. Do you think Michigan will go to the transfer portal for a left tackle? And if we do, what kind of tackle would you like that to be?
I think you'd want Miles Hinton part two. That's kind of what I'd be looking at. A guy who's been productive in his college career. Carmona from Arkansas, obviously moving from San Jose State last year. That's kind of the model because you look in, he comes in, immediately plays really high level football. That's what I'd be looking for in left tackle. Honestly, though, there's an element of me having probably changing my mind a little bit on what they might do with the offensive line because I wouldn't mind maybe seeing something like what Texas A&M did. Like, I think we were like, oh, if they just get more out of those guys in Texas A&M from that last year, from this year, like, oh, you can maybe have a better unit. I wouldn't mind seeing a bit of competition, to be very frank, because the big issue I have is the older guys have not played good enough. Like, you look at Giovanni Alhadi, Crippen, like Guidis, like those guys just haven't played particularly great football for Michigan. I'm comfortable. I'm like confident. Like, you look at a Phobie, Guinera, some of those younger offensive linemen, you kind of like what they can do in the interior. But I wouldn't mind seeing them bring in some new guys to add some competition because I think they probably need it a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that. And again, I think you can never have enough good offensive linemen. I think we've figured that out. That was kind of Michigan's blueprint. I mean, Michigan's been going to the transfer portal and getting an offensive lineman who I don't even know what we could do with back when we were winning a national championship. I'm kind of with you. There's two different types of tackles that will be in the transfer portal. One of which will be those highly touted tackles out of high school that haven't gotten an opportunity to play. And then the other kind would be group of 5 guys that have played 3 straight seasons, have played really well, and are looking to play at the Power 4 level before they go to the NFL draft. That's my preferred tackle, especially with the true freshman quarterback coming in. Tackle is a very difficult position to evaluate out of high school. And I think some of those guys that were highly touted out of high school, they just might not be all that good. And there's a strong sample size. And I think you consider one Fernando Carmona, who jumped from that group of 5 to the Power 4 level, to the SEC level, and translated really well. There's a lot of those examples over the last 2 years of the transfer portal. There's not as many examples of guys that just haven't really played, and then you transplant them to another place, and then all of a sudden they become good football players. And so I'm kind of with you. That's the type of tackle. I don't have any names right now because you got to just see what names end up hitting the transfer portal, and we'll kind of circle back to this conversation, but I'm kind of with you there. Dill, this is the last position that I think Michigan needs to address, and that's the interior defensive line. Depth was a problem this year, right? I mean, outside of Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant and Rayshawn Benny at times played some good football, there's been a little bit of a drop-off. And I think you've seen some young cats get better as the year's gone on. I think that's exciting for Michigan fans. But I think at the end of the day, I don't think you have the young pups on this team to just kind of replace the production that Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant giving you. You're probably not going to replace the production, period. Those are 2 just studs. That being said, there are some names in the transfer portal. One I think you'll like, Dill. One I think you won't like. Let's start with Jaheim Otis from Alabama. How are we feeling about that one?
Jaheim Otis is a tough one because there is a level where he just hasn't quite like caught in his groove, if you will, in college. And it's getting a little late in his career. Again, like it didn't like that wasn't an amicable split either at Alabama. That didn't
No.
sound like the coaches had the greatest things, frankly, to say about him. I don't think he had the greatest feelings leaving Alabama. This one's a tough one because again, you've seen him play extremely good football,
Yes.
but you certainly have some questions because it's been wildly inconsistent.
So here's my take, because I guess we'll just flip over to the next one. This is the one I thought you'd really have some question marks about, Bear Alexander, which I'm sure you do. Maybe two very similar kind of guys. Guys that you've seen play some really, really good football on the inside of the defensive line. There's no argument against them being supremely talented guys. They just haven't been consistent. They've obviously had some off the field stuff. Bear Alexander, most notably, kind of in the media with disagreeing with playing time and all that. Here's my take, and I'm not necessarily banging the table for these kids, right? I think Michigan's one of those programs that they can do that. I think if they're this team might not be that great in 2024. What you can argue is they don't have a very strong culture.
See, I would have thought that that would have made, but I honestly think you look like this is going to be led from the young guys. I think right now because you look at kind of the classes that have filled in behind the JJs, the Sandristills, the Corums. Those guys, I just again, they didn't recruit the same way those last couple of years. I think you look to me, the future is going to be about these young guys, the Bryce Underwoods, the Shamari Earls, the Oleshes, those guys. To me, I think I don't know that you want to go in with veterans who have had some of those issues, frankly, at their previous schools, because I think you look the young guys to me are going to be the leaders. Bryce.
Yeah, I'll probably. Yeah, you ain't bringing Bear Alexander in to be a leader on this team. I think I'm certainly not making that argument, but I do think even regardless, and that's a really good point. When we talk about culture and we talk about leadership, we have lost a lot of those guys that have embodied that. JJ and Aiden Hutchinson and Blake Corum, all those, Mikey Sandstrill. So maybe the question is, do we feel like we have enough of those leaders going into 2025 where we feel comfortable bringing in a guy like Bear Alexander? That's probably fair, right? I do think Michigan has a very strong culture, but maybe because we've kind of losing some of the, Colson Loveland or Mason Graham from this year moving on,
because even the guys you don't have those stars right now aside from those 5 guys who are kind of the holdovers.
Yeah.
And again, I think a lot of that starts with the fact that on Harbaugh's way out, he was not recruiting the way he needed to. I do think there's a bit of a
I don't think recruiting. I don't give a damn. It's this is less about recruiting talent and more hey, do we feel like our locker room can bring in a guy like Bear Alexander?
Yeah, but if you don't have if you're big dogs aren't or your leaders aren't your big dogs, it feels a little bit different to me right now. Again, I feel I'm not sure that this group of juniors and seniors right now will be the best players. I think these young guys are kind of going to be the stars of the show.
Yeah, that's fair.
You're the more
okay. You made a strong argument. I'll maybe temper my take was I didn't really have a take either way. It's hey, we need these kind of bodies. These will be some of the best bodies that are available.
Give me a CJ West or JVR Suggs. Those guys are playing good football for their respective schools. I love the way CJ West is playing. Again, came from a smaller school, definitely didn't have the fanfare of some of those big top end transfer guys, but they're playing better football at the end of the day.
Who also I'd add to that list? Gavin Mayer for USC.
Yeah,
5th-year guy coming from Wyoming.
Nate Clifton, same thing.
And he ain't going to be like a Mason Graham in the NFL draft. But that dude's playing his tail off and giving USC a lot of good reps on the inside. All right, you know what? That's fair. We'll see how Michigan. And again, there might be some really good defensive linemen hit the portal that aren't Bear Alexander too, who we'd probably like.
They will. It's a good guy. Again, with those guys from Toledo or those schools that okay, they were the best. They just
my only question is sometimes, and okay, fair. I was gonna
say.
Then
we gotta trust Coach Esposito, and we gotta put it in God's hands. Then.
Yes, well, I do trust this staff in terms of filling guys in the right way. If there's one thing I do trust is hey, we haven't recruited at an elite level, but we do fill the roster with good bodies. The culture strong, and so I would trust Sherrone Moore or Lou Esposito to get guys that we think are going to fit. We'll pause it there. A lot of different ways, and these conversations will have a little bit more substance behind it once names start hitting the transfer portal. It's gonna be fun. We got 7 days until the floodgates open. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.